Hey everyone, so we've been taking a look at art at the beginning of the 20th century, leading up to World War I. I want to take a look at a movement that responds directly to World War I. And it's going to come about during the war and then it's going to get more international fame after the war as people feel that the whole war was pointless, that no one really won on either side. But let's take a look at Dadaism and what they're seeking to do. And what I want to suggest to you is that every movement that comes after Dadaism has to reconcile with its ideas. It starts some deep, fundamental questions about art that art is still trying to grapple with to this day, right? So everyone has to come through, all the major artists have to come through Dadaism in some way. So it's good to think about this as a basis for understanding all art that comes after this in the 20th and into the 21st century. Dadaism was an art movement that arose in 1916 during the war, so 2 years into the war, as a way for artists to protest the war. It mainly began in Switzerland, which was politically neutral during the war. And so you had a lot of artists that didn't want to fight in the war moving to Switzerland to escape it. And so as they were all in Zurich at the time, they said, hey, let's come together and make an art movement. And they started thinking about, well, what would this art movement be? Well, let's start protesting the insanity of war. And so then that kind of led to other things. But it wasn't very popular during the war. You can't be critical of a war, generally speaking, historically speaking, when there's a war going on. But after the war, when people start thinking about the totality and the meaning of it, then it's a lot easier to critique. And so it gains international fame during the 1920s after the war, which ends in 1918, the armistice, and then officially ends in 1919. Dadaism seeks to eliminate all social and political institutions because such institutions promise order and meaning to a seemingly chaotic and meaningless world. And I think that's an important idea to reconcile in terms of Dadaism, is they think that all social and political institutions are flawed because they're created by human beings. Human beings are flawed. And they lead to things like people coming together and saying, hey, I want your piece of land. And someone else saying, hey, no, I want your piece of land. And so they start going to war. Political entities generally tend to, historically speaking, in their mind, lead to chaos and destruction. And so they're suggesting, let's tear them all down and start again. So in some ways, it has some roots in futurism, this idea of tearing down the existing social order, revolt, but they're not doing this necessarily politically. They're doing this artistically speaking. So they're thinking about that the political institutions are corrupt, the social institutions are corrupt, so we need to tear them down and find some new ideas. Because if we keep doing what we're doing, we're always going to be in the problem, right? If you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got, right? So they're suggesting we need to do something radically different to find a better way to exist, right? But a lot of these social and political institutions, they promise order and meaning. I know the way. I'm the best leader, the best king, the best ruler, the best social institution, whatever it is. And they say, if you follow me, I'll tell you all about why am I here, where am I going, right? Those kind of questions. And they're suggesting these political and social institutions don't have these answers, that they tend to be self-driven, right? And so they're questioning the idea of order and meaning. Their criticisms even extend to art because art is an institution that promises rational meaning and order. Thus, they seek to tear down all the values of art and the artist's role in creating art. And their works are generally playful criticism against rational order. And I think that's an important part to note, is that that it is meant to be playful. Sometimes we take a look at what they're doing and we say, well, that seems blasphemous for an artist to do. And we forget that what they're doing is they're questioning art and our desire to make art. And the idea of past art that says, we're trying to recreate this utopian ideal, follow us, right? Cubism suggesting we're trying to tear down the ideas of society and rebuild a new order. Dadaism is suggesting we need to tear down the existing order and structure to society, but they're not promoting a way to restructure it, right? So that's where they're kind of pulling back. They're saying we don't have all the answers. And in fact, they suggest even further, maybe there are no one answer out there. And so they mainly criticize rationality, the idea of human reason. They believe that human reason is flawed. And so any type of effort to find human reason, whether it's science, whether it's history, whether it's politics, and all of these institutions try to find meaning. That we take events, we take ideas, we organize them in some way, and we say we found meaning. And they're suggesting maybe there is no greater structure to this, right? If you get a flat tire between Rexburg and Idaho Falls, maybe that doesn't necessarily have greater meaning to it. Maybe just some tires go flat, right? Maybe this war, which was promised, World War I, we're going to find meaning and order, just go and kill the other side. Maybe that promise is hollow. Maybe the war doesn't have meaning. Maybe the war is meaningless. And then that is going to catch on in the 1920s because people are going to feel that the war was meaningless. But I can see how this idea would rub people the wrong way. I think a lot of people want to have everything have some type of significance or value to their lives. And I think even in the church, we tend to think that everything has a specific meaning. And maybe some things do have greater meaning and some things just happen because life happens, right? But I think sometimes we push against that because if we suggest sometimes things happen because life happens, it seems a little bit less clear. And we like clarity. We don't like ambiguity. We don't like things when it's uncertain. We want certainty. We want, facts. We want data. And they're suggesting maybe some elements of life are a little more random than we would like to believe. And so art should reflect that randomness. And so here you have an example of how to create a Dadaist poem. To make a Dadaist poem, take a newspaper, take a pair of scissors, choose an article as long as you are planning to make it your poem, cut out the article, then cut out each of the words and then make up this article and put them in a bag. Shake gently, which is the important part. Then take out the scraps one after the other in the order in which they left the bag. Copy conscientiously. The poem will be like you. And here you are a writer infinitely original and endowed with the sensibility that is charming, though beyond the understanding of vulgar. And so the idea here is you just can put random words in a bag and take them out and poof, you have poetry. And the idea here is that this poem will have as much meaning as any other poet that's out there. Because if life is random, art, poetry should reflect that randomness. But a poet generally says, no, I have meaning. I'm going to have truth here. I'm going to really dig deep and see what the meaning of life is or what the meaning of this particular day or season is. And they're going to give us meaning to say, oh, this is great insight, right? Well, Dadaism suggests those efforts are essentially futile. And so an artist can just put something in a bag, words in a bag, and pull them out. And it will be true, in fact, that it represents the randomness of life. Now, again, sometimes we push against that, and it feels uncomfortable. But it captures the playfulness of Dadaism. It captures the randomness of Dadaism, right? And so this is what they're responding to, right? This idea of step into your place, go and fight for God and country, do your duty. But the realities of what the war is starkly different from the propaganda posters of just getting in line, grabbing a gun and going, and you're going to have a parade at the end. Everyone's going to celebrate you. The idea of chemical weapons were being used for the first time. People were blinded by these chemical weapons. Here you see them running into no man's land. The horrors of war were unprecedented for the time. The idea of using modern technology, seen here with a great grenade. Here's no man's land, which was filled with barbed wire and landmines, and here they're throwing this grenade into the enemy trench, seen here. Or I guess this is more of a grave, but into the enemy trench to try to kill the other side. But the idea for grenades, the idea for tanks that are being developed, the idea for airplanes or chemical weapons was trying to kill the other side. And so science, reason, technology were being used to create death and destruction. And so people that were experiencing this just said, this is horrific. This can't be what life is about. This can't be what our nation is about. There has to be something different. Here you just see a flamethrower where they go into one of the trenches and they just burn everybody that's there. But this idea of the propaganda suggests teamwork builds ships. We can all work together, this harmonious goal. but it's much more horrific than that. And this is an area that's been bombarded by bombs. You can see how it's affected nature, and these people that are walking just kind of not really alive and not really dead from one area to the next. And then you have just another juxtaposition between Otto Dix and the trench suicide, and then this soldier here, the propaganda. We took the hill, come and help us keep it. And so this idea of you join us, we have the ideas, we have the insights, but the reality of the war, Otto Dix, the soldier that commits suicide rather than living another day with constantly being afraid of death or constantly seeing your comrades die and then having the guilt of surviving, right? Or the horrors of war, we see the wounded soldier, the idea that death, right, has this kind of glorious, this person here is being pulled by a Red Cross worker from the battlefield, and death has this kind of glory and honor. But in reality, the soldiers were experiencing the terrors of war. And so there is a lot of tension that's happening during the war between what was being promoted and the actual reality. The image that you see on the bottom is of Flanders Field. I went to Flanders Field a couple of years ago, and this was the first field where they used chemical weapons, and it was one of the major battles of World War I. And here you see the crosses, which represent a soldier that died. And this isn't the entirety of the cemetery that's there. It's quite impressive when you go there. It's just very overwhelming. A lot of them they didn't get individual graves. They just got mass graves, as you see here on the top image. But then they get headstones at other locations. And so it was a very difficult thing to contend with as people are coming back from the war. It's also one of the first wars where people could be on the front lines in the morning and then back in London having dinner at a cafe in the evening. So the war felt very real, very powerful in the minds of people because they were hearing these atrocities. And so it deeply affected, thinking about cultural trauma, it deeply affected people, right? The total cost of the war, about 20 million people died during the war. And that is a huge gaping hole in Europe. The hope of the war was that it was going to be over in a few short months. Every side thought, we're going to be home by Christmas and there's going to be a parade. But really what happened was a 4-year stalemate where there were no major victories. I mean, there were victories, subtle victories on either side. But one time one side would invade the trench one day and then they would lose the trench the next day. So it was just kind of a back and forth. The causes was just this buildup of armaments, people building up of soldiers and weaponry. And the idea was you can only march soldiers through the street for so long before there's an actual campaign, and trying to justify taxing people, trying to justify the development, and then the soldiers being bored. It's only a matter of time before people start saying, is there going to be war? Why are we doing this? And so there's this excited buildup of the war. Yes, the shot heard around the world with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand did lead to it to a certain extent. That was the spark. But this was years in the making of people wanting this to happen, right? The warfare that was developed during this time, the technology, demonstrated the dark side of human ingenuity in science and technology. The end of the war came quickly. Mainly what happened was that both sides just decided to stop. We're tired of fighting, and they declared an armistice. And then it took them another year or so to actually work out the nitty-gritty details of the armistice. But the social effects was mainly, one, people became anarchists. They didn't really like political institutions after this. They lost their patriotic values. They felt socially adrift. A lot of them lost their religious beliefs. And a lot of these ideas still carry over in Europe to this day, right? So the immediate effect was the lost generation with writers like Gertrude Stein, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald. They become part of this. They go over to Europe. They experience the war in some way, shape, or form and go to Europe, and they just feel abandoned, right? Dadaism captures this, right? This comes from the Dadaist Manifesto. Every product of disgust that is capable of becoming a negation of the family is Dada. Dada, the abolition of logic, dance of those who are incapable of creation, Dada. Every hierarchy and social equation established for the values of our valets, Dada. Every object, all objects, feelings and obscurities, every apparition and the precise shock of parallel lines are means for the battle of Dada. The abolition of memory, Dada. The abolition of archaeology, Dada. The abolition of prophets, Dada. The abolition of future, Dada. Liberty, Dada. Dada, Dada, Dada. The roar of contorted pains, the interweaving of contraries and all contradictions, freaks and irrelevancies, life, right? So Dada really doesn't really mean anything specific. It means, hobby horse in one language. But it doesn't really have a specific meaning, but it captures the essence of an absurd art movement that's trying to capture the absurdity of life. Right? So after all of these ideas of archaeology or memory or future, they say that's all meaningless to try to find meaning in this world that feels chaotic and meaningless. And so their art is going to reflect that, right? So in some ways, it's similar to futurism in terms of, abolishing all the past, but it's different in terms of life is just random, and so their art is going to reflect that randomness, right? The values are radicalism, obscurity of meaning, not really trying to promote a specific meaning, this idea of defiance, anarchy, rebellion against art itself, which also suggests that has meaning and ideas to it, so they suggest that's out. But what we're going to see is an emphasis on spontaneity, which is just randomly pulling words out of a bag, for instance, and simultaneity, which is just multiple sounds that are happening simultaneously to give us this kind of random feeling. Just taking a look at a couple of artists. Man Ray was a photographer, and some of his photographs demonstrate the ideas of Dadaism. Dadaism leads to total negation. Man is nothing. Everything is of equal unimportance. Everything is irrelevant. Nothing is relevant. The combination of the infinity of ideas and the arbitrariness which governs our existence causes Dadaist to see absurdity in life. And so if everything has importance, then nothing has importance, is their argument. If nothing is important, then everything is important. So it's taking a look at how do we really find meaning in this chaotic and confusing world, right? And they're suggesting it's very difficult. And so their art is going to reflect that difficulty. Here we see the compass, which is not a compass. It's a magnet attached to a gun. And so the question here is, these are just two random found objects, and they link them together, similar to what we see with cubism, with the synthetic cubism of taking objects that aren't meant to be together and piecing them together in a new way to create a new meaning. They take that idea and they run with it, but finding different ideas, finding a different purpose or application for this. Now, we can argue that this is absurd, right? Putting a magnet together with a gun is absurd, and we can just leave it at that. Or we can try to find meaning to it, which maybe they wouldn't like, but it seems to suggest with a gun, this idea of destruction, and a magnet, something that pulls something towards. It seems maybe they're commenting on how humanity tends to be driven towards destruction, destroying ourselves, destroying others, and why there's that violent, darker tendency within us. As we kind of try to inspect who we are and what we bring to the plate, we have to confront the idea of, well, what are we doing, right? What drives us? This one is probably the most famous piece that comes out of Dadaism. This is Marcel Duchamp. We've taken a look at his new Descending a Staircase. This is his fountain. What he does is he goes into a dumpster, finds a used urinal. He gives it the name Fountain, which is not a fountain, but it's a sculpture. But it's a found sculpture. He calls this a ready-made because he didn't really touch it, right? This the manufacturing company does. And then he gives it a pseudonym. He signs it with the pseudonym R. Mutt and dates it 1917. He goes to an art gallery that says, we will display any of your work. So the idea of the avant-garde artist, we're going to display any work that's out there. We just want to display art, right? So we'd want to give modern artists a voice. So he pays them the money, slaps this down, and it was meant to be somewhat of a joke, right? Is this art? But what he doesn't, right, maybe fully realize is how impactful this question that he asserts is. If you suggest this is not art, then you have to then question, well, what is art then? And that becomes a lot more confusing. And this is where artists that come after this have to grapple with. What is art? Does an artist actually have to touch something, sculpt something, manipulate something in some way for it to be art? Because what really, if you get down to the molecule, the atomic level, what really has an artist created, right? Touched, yes. Give it a signature, certainly. But all things are borrowed around us, right? So what really does make something, at what point does something go from not an artist to now it's made by an artist? And who is an artist anyway, right? So creating these deep philosophical questions that art after this is going to take a look at. Here is one review of this. Now, Mr. Mutt's fountain, keeping with the pseudonym that Duchamp signs it with, is not immoral. That is absurd, right? So the idea of saying that this is immoral or blasphemous in some way, that's absurd. No more than a bathtub is absurd. It is a fixture which you see every day in a plumber's store window. Whether Mr. Mutt made the fountain with his hands or not has no importance. He chose it. He took an article of life, placed it so that its useful significance disappeared under a new title and a point of view, creating a new thought for the object. And again, modern art is not about trying to recreate the visual world. It's about trying to create a new thought, a new idea. And the question for this is this enough to make this art? Is it enough to transcend this idea of, although he didn't touch it, he gave it a new context, a new meaning? Is that enough to make it art, right? As for plumbing, that is absurd. The only works of art that America has produced are plumbing and our bridges. I don't know if that's true, but it's an interesting, unnecessary slight at the United States. This is the work of art. Interestingly, this is the one that is in the Pompidou in Paris, and there is, okay, so this is the one that is in Paris, and I thought I had another image. I guess I don't. There's another one of me standing next to it at the Tate Museum in London. And what's funny about this particular work, and I think Duchamp would kind of appreciate the humor within this, is that he originally put this as a thought experiment. I don't know if he ever thought that anyone would buy it or it'd be taken seriously, but it kind of was. But after he takes it down from the gallery, he just kind of loses track of it. And as Dadaism begins to gain international fame, they said, hey, what about that one thing you did in 1917 that you titled The Fountain? That was kind of funny. Do you have that? And he's like, no, why would I? I'm not going to keep that around. And so he said, well, can you recreate it? And he's like, yeah, I can recreate it. And so he goes off and finds another urinal and gives it the same title, dates it 1917. And he does it twice, right? So he does it for a museum in Paris. He does it for a museum in London. And what's funny about this is that now you can see that they're encased in glass to make sure that no one comes up and ruins this particular piece. And so the humorous part of this is it starts as a joke, a thought experiment. But now, because of its cultural significance, because of the questions that it posed, it's now in some of the major art museums of the world, right? Which is amazing to think about, right? So again, it's this idea of this avant-garde movement that might not be accepted at first, but then as the ideas, as society catches up with them, and they start to really reflect on the meaning of the significance of these ideas, the art then becomes quite significant, quite profound, right? We talked about how Van Gogh only sold one work of art in his lifetime, but now they go for, they're constantly breaking records whenever one goes up for sale. And so as society catches up to art, they find their voice, right? This one he considers an assisted ready-made. This is LHOOQ, which loosely translates, this is a French slang for she has a hot backside. That's been vid-angeled. So he goes into the Louvre, buys a postcard, and gives it the title that you see at the bottom of the postcard. The bottom of the postcard to give it new meaning, new context, and the question is this enough, right? So if you suggest that putting, you're signing a urinal is not enough to make it art, does giving the Mona Lisa a mustache and a goatee make it enough? Does giving it a new title make it enough, right? So again, the question is, what makes it enough? And here's another assisted ready-made where he takes two random objects, pieces them together in a similar way that we see with Cubism, piecing them together in a kind of a collage sculpture, and finding new meaning. That the idea that the bicycle wheel itself no longer functions that it used to, in the same way that the stool no longer functions in the same way that it used to. Both of them have a new context. Both of them have new meaning, right? Here's another one, kind of another continuation of the fountain idea. This is what he calls an advance of a broken arm. He goes into a hardware store, buys a shovel, and then puts it in an art museum. And the question is this art? Should it be considered art? Does the artist have to create something, right? And again, what's funny about this one is he lost the original, and then they came back and asked him, and they said, can you redo this? And they're like, yeah, sure. As you can see that he signs Marcel Duchamp down here. This one is in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. But the question that's interesting about this is, if I was to go into Lowe's or Home Depot and buy a snow shovel and go to a museum, major museum, and say, hey, here's my work of art, here's my masterpiece, would they buy it from me? And the answer is no, right? They wouldn't buy it from me because it's an Ostad, and that doesn't have any real street market or street value to it. But a Duchamp does, right? So again, it's questioning this idea of what makes an artist an artist. Is an artist a label? And so I think in some ways, ironically, Duchamp is kind of laughing at the art world, suggesting that what really is art, what is an artist, and maybe we're taking art too seriously. But in some ways, the art world still takes him very seriously, right? And so they still put his art in some of the major museums in the world, even though he's kind of, mocking the whole institution. But that mockery of the institution becomes quite significant, right? The idea of, can art be funny? Can it be humorous? Can it be a satire? I think that he kind of opens the door for that, and questioning the idea of how much do we ascribe to a particular name? How much value do we put to a particular label? Let's take a look at German Dadaism in terms of its reaction war. I just wanted to look at these really quickly. George Gross enlisted in the 2nd Kaiser France Grenade Guards, 1st Company in Berlin, so he is in World War I. He had constant visions of death, which he saw neither as heroic nor sacred. He was released for medical reasons on May 11th, 1914. However, on January 4th, 1917, he was recalled 3 years later to the front. At this point, his condition deteriorated so much that they placed him in a mental hospital in Guben. And later, Gross later indicated that he was released from the war due to severe sinus infection, for which he was later treated. But more likely, he probably had some trauma, some PTSD that he was struggling with. What he represents after the war, he does these prints in a book called Gott mit uns, or God is with us. He represents the war and a very harsh commentary of the war. Here you see in Fit for Active Service, which is one of the images in the book God with Us, you have a soldier being inspected by a medical examiner, surrounded by a board of officers, and the medical examiner says KV, which is German slang for fit for active service. And so this person is fit to go off and fight in the front lines, right? So the irony here is, even in death, there is no release. And so in relation to Dadaism, it's critiquing the war, critiquing rationality. Gross's works are much more of a political commentary, more than just kind of an abstract commentary about life and meaning and logic and reason in and of itself. These are much more geared towards the upper class and the war itself. Here is blood is the best sauce, and so you have these two wealthy bourgeoisie, upper and middle class individuals that are eating this fine dinner here. And in the background, you have the war going on where people are dying, and they're completely oblivious to it. They're benefiting, they're profiting from the war. And so he's getting us to think about war and our connection to it, or the possession of toads. And here we have the rich bureaucrats who are playing a game, they're gambling. Meanwhile, you have a soldier here who has lost his leg, service of God and country. But do people really care, right? Do these individuals really care about his service, or do they only care about themselves? Again, getting us to question the idea, do political institutions lead us to better ends, or are they only serving themselves? And a similar idea, he does another book called The Face of the Ruling Class. This is the gratitude of the fatherland, one of the images inside that. Here you have a soldier who lost both legs, lost a hand, lost a nose, and can't work and now has reduced to begging for sustenance. And these people are kind of completely oblivious to him. And so the question is, how well are we treating the veterans? When we said go fight and serve, are we treating them as well as we should when they return, right? So a clear criticisms of we need them to fight, but once the fighting is over, we kind of lose interest, right? Or this one is the proletariat is unarmed, the idea of going in and attacking, and this individual here has the champagne and a baby on the sword and complete destruction and death around him. And so the idea of this military industrial complex coming in and using destruction, or after the war idle, right? So the idea of marching through the streets during war, but then after the war, it's not glorious, it's not harmonious. Or this one, these people are, well, they only want work. And so an individual coming in lost his leg during the war, going into these individuals who, I don't know if they're playing a game, having dinner, it looks like they could be doing either. They have the champagne on ice, demonstrating their wealth, and this person's coming in asking for a job, and they completely don't care. So again, the idea of Dadaism, just to connect what's happening in Paris with what's happening in Germany, is questioning the world around us and questioning the traditional meanings and traditional interpretations, and suggesting that we need to have a serious reflection of who's in power, why they're in power, and the idea of where we find meaning, right? We might need to find meaning elsewhere in other forms than our current social and political institutions, right? Some ideas to think about how artists are responding to the war, or a particular art movement that's responding to war, and their reactions to this tragedy.